"Marry her," said the Duke of Uffington, and the card-room went so quiet that the fire could be heard eating its log. "I would sooner marry the library ladder." The laughter came a half-beat late, the way laughter does when a great man has said something unworthy, and his guests must first decide whether to call it wit. Cashin did not hear the laughter properly. What he heard was the small chime of china behind him, a tea tray set down upon the pier table with perfect steadiness, one cup ringing once against its saucer, and then nothing. He turned. Winifred Lark stood in the doorway in her gray stuff gown with her hands folded at her waist, and her face was so composed that for one wild moment he permitted himself to believe she had heard nothing at all. "The ladder is in the north alcove, Your Grace," she said. "It wants oiling. Shall I ask Mrs. Dunnage to see to it before the banns are read?" Someone laughed in earnest then. Cashin did not. He stood with a hand of cards going soft in his fingers and watched his aunt's companion cross the room, pour out the tea for 4 elderly gentlemen who had gambled away better fortunes than hers, and withdraw without once looking at him. He had said it to close a door. His Aunt Augusta had been at him for the length of 2 rubbers of whist about Miss Lark's steadiness, Miss Lark's fine hand, Miss Lark's uncommon head, and a duke learns young that the fastest way to end such talk is to make it laughable. He had not considered that a woman who moved as quietly as she did might arrive in a doorway without warning. "That," said Lady Augusta from her chair by the fire, in the voice she had used on him when he was 7 and had thrown a slate at his tutor, "was the cheapest thing I have ever heard you say. And I heard your father speak." "It was a jest." "It was an axe," said his aunt, and returned to her cards. He told himself that night that it would mend. Servants and companions forgave dukes as a matter of policy. There was no other trade to be had in it. But when he came down to the library at 5 the next morning, as he had come down to the library at 5 nearly every morning for 2 years because sleep, and he had parted company, the candle was already lit and the fire already fed, and Winifred was already there at the long table with the catalogue open before her. She rose. That was the first wrong thing. She had never risen for him in that room. "Your Grace, I shall be finished with the west shelves within the hour and out of your way." "Sit down, Miss Lark." "I would rather stand, if it is the same to your Grace." It was not the same to him. He discovered that it was not remotely the same to him. For 2 years the library at dawn had been the one hour of his day in which he was not the Duke of Uffington. He had come down first out of restlessness, and found her copying music by candlelight because the mornings were her own and she chose to spend them making something. He had asked her once, brusquely, what she was about. She had told him. He had asked her another morning what she was reading, and she had told him that too, and then told him he was wrong about it, which no one at Uffington had done since his brother died. Everard, that was the whole of it if he were honest, and at 5 in the morning he generally was. Everard had gone out to Portugal with his regiment and come home in a lead-lined box of a fever in the 3rd week, having fired no shot at all, and the house had closed over the fact like water over a stone. Nobody said his name. Guests spoke of the late lord, the sad business, your loss. Winifred Lark had come to be his aunt's companion 4 months after the funeral, and one morning, cataloguing, she had held up a battered volume of Ovid with a boy's initials scratched inside the cover, and said, plainly, as though speaking of a living man, "Your brother had a shocking hand. Did he improve, or did he simply write faster?" Cashin had laughed. It had been the first time in 111 days, and it had hurt like a wound closing. After that the mornings had a shape. She read him the sensible parts of his own steward's reports, having a better head for figures than the steward. She moved his chess pieces when he left the board mid-game, always improving his position, never admitting it. He had told himself for 2 years that this was nothing, because it had no name, and a thing with no name cannot be lost. Now she stood at the end of the table with her hands behind her back, correct as a footman, and would not sit, and would not be wrong about anything, and something in him understood that he had lost it, and had signed for the loss himself in front of 9 witnesses. "Miss Lark, Your Grace, what I said last evening in the card-room was perfectly true, Your Grace," she said, without heat, without pity, without the smallest crack in her. "I am my lady's companion. It would be an absurd match, and it does no good for absurdities to be spoken of, so I am glad the matter is settled. Will you take the north window this morning? The light is better there, and I shall not disturb you." She went back to her catalogue. He stood in his own library, holding a cold candlestick like a man who had come to the wrong house. 3 weeks of it. 3 weeks of that flawless courtesy, which he came to understand was a kind of gate, shut and bolted, and painted a pleasing color so that no one need remark upon the shutting. She still read to his aunt in the yellow parlor. Her voice through the door was the same warm, dry, deliberate voice, and it stopped being that voice the moment he entered. She still corrected the steward's arithmetic, but she did it now in pencil in the margin, and left the ledger on his desk with a folded note, unsigned. She no longer touched the chessboard. His white knight stood for 3 weeks precisely where he had abandoned it, in a position he now saw was hopeless, and he could not bring himself to move the piece or clear the board. At the end of the 3rd week Mr. Gideon Halloway came to dine. Halloway was a barrister with 400 acres at Nettlefold, and a laugh you could hear from the stable yard, and Cashin had known him since they were both boys pushing each other into the mill leat. He arrived in a mud-spattered gig, apologized to Lady Augusta for it at unnecessary length, and then, over the soup, addressed a question about the enclosure bill to Miss Lark, as though she were a person whose answer he wanted. She gave it to him. Cashin watched Halloway's face change while she spoke, watched him sit forward, put down his spoon, and ask a second question, and a third. Winifred Lark argued with Gideon Halloway for the length of 2 courses about drainage and the poor rate, and she was not correct and composed and bolted shut. She was laughing. She had a small crease at the corner of her mouth when she thought she had won a point, and Cashin had known about that crease for 2 years, and had believed, in some unexamined place, that he was the only man in England who had ever been shown it. He sat at the head of his own table and said almost nothing, and his aunt watched him do it with an expression he chose not to interpret. Halloway came again on the Tuesday, with a book he had promised her. He came the following week to look at the Uffington pumps, which required no looking at, and stayed to walk to the ice house with Miss Lark and Lady Augusta's spaniel. By the end of October his gig was so regular a feature of the drive that the grooms had stopped announcing it. Cashin, meanwhile, learned a great deal about himself that he had no wish to know. He learned that he could stand at the long window of the gallery for 11 minutes watching 2 figures come up the avenue under one umbrella. He learned that he was capable of inventing errands to the yellow parlor and abandoning them at the door. He learned that a man may be perfectly civil to a friend while wishing him at the bottom of the German Ocean, and that this does not make him a good man, only a well-bred one. On the first Friday in November, Halloway found him in the gun room, turned his hat over twice in his hands, and said, "Uffington, I want to ask your leave for something, and I would rather ask it of you than behind your back, since she is under your roof." Cashin set down the ramrod he had been holding for no reason at all. He knew, with absolute clarity, what was coming, and he knew equally that a single true sentence spoken in the next 4 seconds would prevent it. He said, "Ask." "I mean to make Miss Lark an offer," Halloway said. "Not a genteel arrangement. An offer of marriage at Nettlefold, with the house made over to her in the settlement. She has no family to apply to and no fortune to be haggled over, which I count a mercy. But she has your aunt's household to consider, and I will not have it whispered that I poached a companion out of a duke's parlor. So I am telling you, if you think I am not good enough for her, say it now and I will hear you out." The fire in the gun-room was small and did poor work. Cashin looked at the man he had known for 30 years, at the honest, weathered face, and the hat being punished between two large hands, and understood that Gideon Halloway was in every particular good enough, and that this was the worst news he had ever received in that room, including the news about Everard, which had at least been delivered by a stranger. "Nettlefold is a damp house," he said. "I have drained it, she told me how." Cashin looked at the wall of guns. "Then I have no objection to make." Halloway let out a breath, wrung his hat once more, and said, with the frightful generosity of a happy man, "You are a decent fellow, Uffington. Come to the harvest ball. I mean to ask her there when the toasts are done. Half the county has been kind to her, and I want them to see it done properly, and not in a corner as though she were something to be got past." He asked her there. Cashin went. The Nettlefold harvest ball was held in the long tithe barn, hung with lanterns and swags of hop vine, the flagstones chalked, the fiddlers on a hay wagon, and every farmer and attorney and half-pay officer for 15 miles crushed in shoulder to shoulder. Winifred Lark came in Lady Augusta's carriage in a gown of dark green silk that Cashin had never seen before and could not stop seeing, with a bunch of late roses pinned at her shoulder that had certainly traveled from Nettlefold that morning in Halloway's gig. She danced. She danced the first with Halloway, and the second with the vicar, and the third with an ancient tenant of Cashin's own, who had not danced since the old Duke's time, and she was kind to him without once making him feel it. And Cashin stood by the door with a glass of cider. He did not drink, and watched the thing he had thrown away being handled carefully by better men. At 11:30 the fiddles stopped. Halloway climbed onto the wagon step with a glass in his hand, red to the ears, and the barn began to hush in that dreadful expectant way that crowds have. "Friends," he said, "neighbors, I have a thing to say, and I mean to say it badly." Cashin heard himself set down the cider. He had spent 3 weeks assembling reasons: the estate, the name, his aunt, whose comfort depended upon the woman in question, the county, which forgives a duke almost anything except a marriage below him, and forgives the woman nothing at all. He had marshaled these reasons like troops, and standing in the door of a barn full of hop vine, he discovered that not one of them was a reason. They were all merely the sound a coward makes. He also knew, with unpleasant precision, what he had earned. He had earned a shut gate. He had earned the library ladder for the rest of his life. Halloway drew breath, and Cashin, Duke of Uffington, said, into the hush, in a voice that carried the length of the barn because he had never in his life had to raise it, "Halloway, stop." 200 faces turned. He walked out into the chalked floor because there was nowhere else to go, and stopped in front of Winifred Lark, who had gone very white and very straight, and who did not step back. "Sir," she said quietly, "you will make me the subject of a scene." "You are already the subject of a scene. He was about to make you one, and I find I cannot let him do it in my place." He turned first to Halloway, because that debt came first. "You asked me in the gun-room whether I thought you good enough for her. I said I had no objection. I lied to you, and I have never lied to you since we were 11. My objection is that I love her, and have loved her for 2 years, and was too proud a fool to say so. And last month I said something in a card room that I would give Uffington, and every acre of it to unsay. Nobody in the barn moved. The fiddler on the wagon lowered his bow with a scrape. "Well," said Holloway, after a long moment, in the flattened voice of a man rebuilding an evening from the foundations, "that is an objection." Cashin turned back to her. He had rehearsed nothing, and so what came was plain. "Miss Lark, I said I would sooner marry a ladder. I have thought of little else since, and I have concluded that what I meant was that a ladder cannot refuse a man, and cannot look at him at 5 in the morning as though he were worth something, and cannot take that look away again. You took it away. You were entirely right to. I have spent 3 weeks in a house where you are perfectly civil to me, and I would rather be shot at. Your Grace, you catalogued my brother's books. You said his name out loud when nobody in England would say it. You have corrected my steward's arithmetic in pencil for 2 years and let him keep the credit, and you have never once in all that time asked me for anything." His voice went, and he let it. "Ask me for something. Ask me now, and before all these people, and I will give it." The silence in that barn had weight, like standing water. Winifred Lark looked at him for a long time. Then she said, not loudly, but the barn was so quiet that the far end heard it, "Very well. I ask you to say it properly." "I have said it." "You have confessed it, sir, which is not the same thing. You told these people that you love me and that you were a fool. That is a speech about yourself." Her chin came up and the crease appeared at the corner of her mouth, and it was not amusement, it was steel. "I have been spoken about for 3 weeks. I should like once to be spoken to. Ask me, as a question, and understand that a question may be answered no." Cashin, who had never in 38 years been made to stand and be examined by anybody, and who had certainly never done it on a chalked floor in front of 200 people in Hop Vine, felt something in his chest let go all at once, like a horse given its head. He said, "Winifred, will you marry me?" She let him wait. She let the whole barn wait, and afterwards he thought he had never respected a living soul so much as in those 4 seconds. "Yes," she said, "you have been a very great fool, and I will." The barn came apart. The fiddler struck up something entirely unsuitable. A farmer's wife was heard to say it was the best harvest ball in 40 years. Gideon Holloway drank off his own toasting glass in one swallow, wiped his mouth, and then, being the man he was the first to take Cashin's hand and the second to take hers, and the roses stayed pinned at her shoulder all evening, because she said it would be shabby to take them off, and she was right, as usual. They were married in the small chapel at Uffington 11 weeks later, in January, with snow banked against the yews and Lady Augusta weeping into a handkerchief and denying it. Holloway stood up with him. Winifred wore green again, which scandalized precisely one dowager, and walked up the aisle at her own unhurried pace, looking at him the whole way. Cashin remembered, ever after, one thing more clearly than the vows. On the morning of the wedding, he had come down to the library at 5 out of habit, and found the candle lit, and the fire fed, and the chessboard set out, and his white knight moved at last into a position from which the game could be saved. Beside it lay a note in her fine hand, unsigned, as her notes had always been. "The ladder has been oiled. It was extremely put out to hear the news." He kept that scrap of paper in his pocketbook for the rest of his life, and in the years afterwards, when the library at dawn was no longer the only hour in which he was not a duke, he would sometimes take it out and read it, and his wife, without looking up from the ledgers she had never surrendered to anyone, would say that a man of his consequence ought to be ashamed of himself. He was not once and never again.